In 1967, a magazine assigned a label to a plot of land in Jefferson City, Missouri, and that label never left. The bloodiest 47 acres in America. The land in question was not a battlefield. It was not a slaughterhouse district or a frontier town that had long since burned to the ground. It was a prison, one that had been standing and filling and breaking people for over a century by the time the label found it. The Missouri State Penitentiary opened in March of 1836. The Alamo fell that same month. Andrew Jackson was still in the White House. The prison operated continuously for 168 years, long enough that Alcatraz opened in 1934 and closed in 1963, its entire lifespan fitting inside Missouri's like a stone dropped into a river. At its peak, the penitentiary held more than 5,000 inmates behind walls of locally quarried limestone on the banks of the Missouri River, the oldest prison west of the Mississippi, and by most accounts, the hardest. The defining moment came on the night of September 22, 1954, when 2,500 men broke loose inside those walls, set the factories burning, and forced state troopers onto the roof with machine guns. But that night was not the beginning of the story. It was the point at which everything that had been building for over a century finally became impossible to ignore. This is the story of how a building constructed to anchor a state capital became something its founders never intended, and what it cost the people inside it. Chapter 1. A prison to anchor a capital. In 1831, Jefferson City had a problem. It had been designated the capital of Missouri 9 years earlier, but the designation was never quite secure. Other towns wanted the title. The competition was real, and the city's claim on it rested on a foundation that was more political than practical. The state needed institutions that would make the question of the capital feel settled once and for all. Governor John Miller understood this. His solution was not a courthouse or a university. It was a prison. The logic was straightforward, if cold. A maximum security penitentiary required substantial infrastructure, generated employment, and most importantly, was not the kind of thing a legislature moved once it had been built. Anchor the prison in Jefferson City, and you anchored the capital along with it. In the fall of 1832, the first legislative proposals for the penitentiary were submitted. A bill was signed into law in January of 1833. The legislature appropriated $25,000 for the project and appointed James Dunica to oversee construction. Dunica was a master stonemason, the same man who had built Jefferson City's first Capitol building in 1826. He knew the land, knew the stone, and knew how to build things meant to last. The prison's design was attributed to John Haviland, a Philadelphia architect who had made his reputation designing penitentiaries, severe, functional buildings organized around control and containment. The site chosen was a stretch of ground on the banks of the Missouri River, at the edge of the city, facing the water. Construction began in 1833. The perimeter walls were built from limestone, quarried directly on site, cut and laid by the hands of men who would later be confined behind them. The walls were estimated complete between 1833 and 1835, rising thick and pale against the Missouri sky, enclosing roughly 47 acres of ground that would not be free again for a very long time. The facility opened in March of 1836. Andrew Jackson sat in the White House for his final 2 years. The frontier was still being mapped, and in Jefferson City, a warden, a single guard, and 15 inmates took up residence inside the new limestone compound. The first man through the gate was Wilson Eidson, sentenced in St. Louis for stealing a watch. It is worth pausing on that detail. 168 years of American penal history, and the first man to enter was jailed for stealing a watch. 11 of the 15 initial inmates were from St. Louis. All but one were incarcerated for larceny. The exception had stabbed a man during a drunken brawl. From the beginning, the prison operated under the Auburn system, a model of discipline developed in New York in the 1820s that had become the dominant philosophy of American incarceration by the time Missouri's walls went up. Under the Auburn system, inmates worked together in silence during the day, returning to individual cells at night. Lockstep marching, no communication, congregate labor in prison workshops. And for any infraction, a glance held too long, a word spoken out of turn, corporal punishment, swift and unquestioned. The buildings that received those first 15 men were spare and hard. A cell house of cut limestone, a warden's residence, the enclosing walls. Nothing decorative, nothing soft. The Missouri River ran nearby, visible from the upper tiers on clear days, a reminder of a world that continued moving without the men behind the walls. Then the Civil War came, and the prison became something it had not been designed for. When Missouri was drawn into the conflict, the penitentiary was pressed into service as a military detention facility. Confederate soldiers and Southern sympathizers were brought inside the walls and held alongside the prison's existing population. The compound, already straining under the weight of its civilian inmates, absorbed the military prisoners without the infrastructure to support them. Disease moved through the overcrowded cell blocks with the efficiency that disease always finds in confined spaces. The records from this period document outbreaks and deaths that the prison's original architects had never planned for, a reminder that a building built to hold criminals had no special immunity to the chaos of a nation tearing itself apart. By the time the war ended, the penitentiary had served 3 distinct functions in under 3 decades: political anchor, criminal institution, and military prison. It was already becoming something larger and stranger than the governor who proposed it had imagined. Jefferson City got its anchor. The question of what that anchor would eventually cost was one nobody was asking yet. Chapter 2: The Walls Expand. A prison is not built once. It is built continuously, in response to a population that refuses to stop growing, in response to a philosophy of punishment that keeps finding new rooms it needs. The Missouri State Penitentiary was no different. What opened in 1836 as a spare limestone compound holding 15 men would spend the next 7 decades expanding outward and upward, adding cell block after cell block, until the 47 acres behind those original walls held a city of their own, with its own architecture, its own hierarchy, its own underground. The first major expansion came after the Civil War. By the 1860s, the prison population had grown well beyond the capacity of the original cell house, and the institution needed a structure built for the long term. In 1868, A Hall was completed. Formally designated Housing Unit 4, it was designed by Warden Horace Swift and constructed almost entirely through convict labor, the inmates quarrying the stone from the ground beneath their own feet and laying it into the walls that would hold them. The result was a 4-story block of individual cells, each one cut from the same pale stone that defined every surface of the compound. Thick walls, narrow openings, the kind of construction that was meant to outlast the men inside it, and did. A standard cell in A Hall measured roughly 6 feet by 9, enough space for a narrow iron bunk, a small shelf, and a bucket. Nothing else. The walls were stone. The door was iron bars. Across the tier, through those bars, a man could see the identical doors of the cells opposite, and the identical doors above and below, stacked 4 stories in both directions. The whole interior of the building, a grid of containment visible from any point within it. There was no privacy and no quiet. Sound carried through stone and iron without interruption. Every cough, every argument, every hour of the night. Men lived in those cells for years. Some lived in them for decades. What made A Hall particularly unforgiving was not the cells themselves, but what lay beneath them. In the basement, a series of dungeon rooms had been carved out. Windowless chambers, entirely without light, where inmates sent for punishment were confined in complete darkness. Up to 6 men could be placed in a single cell. The only interruption to the dark came when a guard slid a plate of cornbread through a narrow slit in the door, 1 plate for however many men were inside, and no further acknowledgement that they existed. A Hall remained in continuous use as a housing unit until the prison's final closure, and its dungeon cells survived intact. Today they are among the most visited spaces on the tour. Between the cell blocks lay the prison yard, the open ground at the center of the compound, where inmates spent whatever limited hours the administration permitted outside their cells. It was not a generous space. The perimeter walls rose on every side, broken only by the guard towers positioned at the corners, each one elevated enough to give a clear line of sight across the entire yard below. There was no view beyond the walls from the yard level. The sky above was the only thing that moved freely. On good days, inmates organized baseball games in that yard, formed teams, kept standings. On bad days, the yard was where tension collected and waited for somewhere to go. Beneath the grounds themselves, another layer of history lay buried. Around 1876, a cell block known as Centennial Hall was constructed and later abandoned before 1920. In 1986, during excavation work for a death row recreation yard, workers uncovered remnants of its lower floor. 8 cells, preserved underground, untouched. Archival research dated them to Centennial Hall's construction period. The cells were documented, then reburied. In 2019, they were re-excavated and stabilized for visitors. An archaeological fragment of the prison's 19th century interior, now interpreted as a feature in the tour route. They are the oldest surviving cell structures on the property. Above ground, the expansion continued. In 1905, Housing Unit 1 was constructed along the northern edge of the compound. Known informally as H Hall, it was built as the women's wing, a 4-story block of iron bar cells that would eventually house some of the prison's most historically significant inmates. The building sat separated from the men's facility, its upper tiers looking out over the same river the original founders had looked out over 7 decades earlier. Housing Unit 3 grew into the largest and most volatile residential block on the property, a massive structure with cells stacked 4 stories high along its interior walls. It would become the focal point of the 1954 riot. After that night, a middle section of steel bars was added across the open interior, extra caging that acknowledged in iron what the events of those hours had proven about the building's design. In its basement sat O Hall, the punishment unit, a dim, damp block of stripped-down cells used for disciplinary confinement. Its shower room fitted with a slotted wood floor, a tin wash tub, and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. On Capitol Avenue, just outside the perimeter walls, stood the warden's house, completed in 1888 and updated in 1907 by architect Morris Frederick Bell in the Queen Anne style. A 2-story frame dwelling on a rough limestone foundation, it featured a rounded tower and 2 front porches, a domestic grace note pressed against the hard institutional geometry of the compound behind it. It now sits on the National Register of Historic Places. By 1932, the Missouri State Penitentiary held roughly 5,300 inmates, the largest single inmate population in the United States at the time. The Jefferson City News-Tribune called it the greatest prison in the world. Chapter 3, Built on Convict Hands. From the moment the Missouri State Penitentiary opened its gates, the state faced a problem it had not fully solved before building the thing: how to pay for it. Feeding, housing, and guarding a growing population of inmates required money the legislature had not budgeted generously, and the answer the 19th century reached for was labor. If the men inside could not pay for their own confinement in cash, they would pay for it in work. The contract labor system came early and stayed long. Under its terms, the state leased its inmates to private manufacturers who set up operations inside the prison walls and used convict labor to produce goods for wholesale markets across the country. The arrangement was straightforward in its economics and brutal in its application. The state collected a fee per inmate per day. The contractors received a workforce that could not quit, could not negotiate, and could not refuse. The incentive for the contractor was to extract maximum output at minimum expense, food kept at subsistence level, clothing minimal, conditions exactly as poor as required to keep men alive and working. The manufacturers who came to Jefferson City knew exactly what they were getting. By the 1870s and 80s, the prison had become a significant industrial center. Between 1876 and 1884 alone, 7 new factories were constructed inside the perimeter walls, their footprints crowding the compound that had once held only a cell house and a warden's residence. Clothing manufacturers arrived. Saddle tree makers arrived. The Missouri State Penitentiary would eventually house the largest saddle tree factory in the world, soap makers, furniture makers, and shoe companies. At the height of the labor era, 6 major shoe manufacturers operated simultaneously inside the walls. At peak production, their combined output reached approximately 7,000 pairs of shoes per day, goods that moved through wholesale channels across the country, touching households that had no reason to know or ask whose hands had made them. The prison, by this accounting, was enormously successful. Inmates cost the state approximately 11 cents per day to maintain. Officials were proud of that figure. It was cited in reports, repeated in newspaper coverage, held up as evidence of institutional efficiency. What it actually measured was how little a human being could be kept alive, for when the people keeping him had no reason to spend more. The men who worked in those factories worked under the same enforced silence that governed every other hour of their lives. A typical day began before dawn, with the lockstep march from the cell blocks to the factory floor. Single file, no talking. The Auburn system's choreography applied to every movement of every body. On the factory floor, quotas governed the hours. A man who fell short of his daily output faced consequences that the guards administered without formal process or appeal. A guard who felt a man was not working fast enough could discipline an inmate on the spot, and did. The labor was not compensated. The commissary was the only place money had meaning inside the walls, and the only way to earn it was through the approval of the very system that had taken everything else. What the factories produced left the walls. What they cost stayed inside them. For decades, this arrangement held. Then, in 1935, federal law brought it to an end. The Asher-Sumner's Act effectively outlawed the interstate sale of goods produced by convict labor, severing the commercial pipeline that had justified the prison's industrial scale. One by one, the manufacturers packed up and left. The factories emptied. The machinery went quiet. The economic rationale that had driven 7 decades of expansion evaporated almost overnight. But the population did not leave with the contractors. The men were still there, now idle, crowded into a compound whose entire interior logic had been organized around keeping them working. The pressure that built in the years after 1935 was not invisible. It had surfaced even earlier, in 1930, when roughly 1,250 inmates refused to work, struck the factories, and occupied the dining hall over a demand so elemental it has been recorded simply as this: they were tired of Irish stew. The governor was called. The prisoners were persuaded back to their cells. And then, investigating further, authorities discovered what lay beneath the food complaint: an organized plot to burn the factories and break out entirely. The stew was never really about the stew. What the Missouri State Penitentiary had become, by the time its labor empire collapsed, was a place that historian Mark Schreiber would later describe in the plainest possible terms. Asked to compare it to other American prisons, he said only that it was older and meaner. It was a description that required nothing added to it. Chapter 4. Who the Walls Held. 168 years is long enough to hold a great many people. Long enough that the prison's roster stops reading like a list of inmates and starts reading like a cross-section of American life. The criminal, the political, the famous, the forgotten, and the occasional man who managed to be all of those things at once. The Missouri State Penitentiary held them all indiscriminately, behind the same limestone walls, under the same rules, eating the same food. What they carried in with them, and what the walls did to it, is another matter entirely. Charles Arthur Floyd arrived in December of 1925. He was 21 years old, convicted of robbery out of St. Louis, sentenced to 5 years, and he carried into the Missouri State Penitentiary the same combination of poverty, restlessness, and poor judgment that had defined his life in the Cookson Hills of Oklahoma before it defined his criminal record in Missouri. Inside the walls, he was assigned to the factory floor like everyone else: the lockstep march, the enforced silence, the daily quota. He was young enough that the institution still had the possibility of shaping him. It did not shape him in the direction it intended. He was released in 1927, having served less than 2 years, and walked back out into a country still years away from understanding what he would become. Pretty Boy Floyd, the name the newspapers eventually made permanent, would go on to rob banks across the Midwest, become one of the most wanted men in America, and be shot dead by law enforcement in a cornfield in Ohio in October of 1934. He was 30 years old. The Missouri State Penitentiary was one of the first institutions that tried to contain him. In the same decade, a quieter kind of fame was being built inside the prison's walls. Harry Snodgrass, incarcerated in the mid-1920s, had a gift that the prison administration, in an unusual act of pragmatism, decided to use rather than suppress. Snodgrass played piano with a precision and feeling that had earned him the informal title King of the Ivories. And during his time at the penitentiary, he broadcast live performances over radio station WOS, the state's own broadcast signal, from inside the walls. Listeners across Missouri heard a man play without knowing, or perhaps without being told, exactly where he was sitting when he played. He died in 1937. Emma Goldman arrived at the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1917, sentenced for conspiracy to obstruct the draft, a charge that grew from her public opposition to the First World War. The United States government had labeled her the most dangerous woman in America, a designation that said as much about the government's anxiety as it did about Goldman herself. Inside the prison, she was assigned to the clothing factory and required to work 50 hours a week, the same quota, the same silence, the same system that governed the men on the other side of the compound wall. She was forbidden from corresponding with her associates on the outside. She organized the women around her anyway. Goldman understood, from decades of labor organizing and political agitation, that the first act of resistance available to any confined population was solidarity. The decision to treat the person in the next cell as an ally rather than a stranger. She built that solidarity inside H. Hall with the same methodical patience she had applied to every other struggle in her life. Prison administrators eventually concluded that releasing her early was preferable to continuing to contain her. She walked out in 1919, and her published accounts of conditions inside the Missouri State Penitentiary fed directly into the national prison reform conversation that gathered force through the 1920s. Kate Richards O'Hare followed her through the same gates that same year. O'Hare was the chairman of the Socialist Labor Party, convicted under the Espionage Act for an anti-war speech she had given in Bowman, North Dakota. Her sentence was 5 years. Inside the penitentiary, she was put to work in the clothing factory, forbidden from communicating with her husband and 4 children, and subjected to the same conditions she would later describe in writing with a clarity that made comfortable people deeply uncomfortable. Her published accounts of life inside the Missouri State Penitentiary reached Congress. President Woodrow Wilson commuted her sentence in 1920. She received a full pardon from President Calvin Coolidge years later. Charles Liston arrived in 1950 on charges that included armed robbery. He was illiterate, the 15th of 17 children, largely abandoned by the father who had fathered him and disappeared. What the Missouri State Penitentiary gave him was boxing. Liston was paroled in the early 1950s. In 1962, he became world heavyweight champion, knocking out Floyd Patterson in the first round. 2 years later, he lost the title to Cassius Clay. He died under unexplained circumstances in 1970. The sport that made him famous was learned inside the walls of a Missouri prison, in a gym that existed because a chaplain decided a young man was worth the trouble. James Earl Ray occupied cell 45 in Housing Unit 3. He arrived in March of 1960 for a series of burglary convictions, and spent 7 years studying the prison's rhythms with the focused patience of a man who intended to leave on his own terms. On April 23, 1967, he folded himself into a bread box loaded onto a delivery truck bound for a satellite facility and rode out through the gates. The prison's walls, which had held thousands of men across more than a century, did not hold him. He was a fugitive for just over a year. On April 4, 1968, James Earl Ray shot and killed the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was apprehended, tried, and transferred to a prison in Tennessee, where he died in 1998. His cell in Housing Unit 3 remains part of the tour today. The prison's final decades added darker names to its roster. Robert Berdella, a Kansas City man convicted in 1988 of crimes so extreme that the details remain among the most disturbing in Missouri criminal history, was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole and died inside the penitentiary in October of 1992. His presence in the institution's final years serves as a reminder that the Missouri State Penitentiary's capacity for housing the worst cases the state could produce did not diminish as the building aged. It ran at that capacity in one form or another all the way to the end. Chapter 5. 40 names on the wall. For most of its history, Missouri killed its condemned men in public. Hangings were carried out in the county seat where the crime had been committed, and they were not quiet affairs. Crowds gathered in their hundreds. Vendors worked the perimeter. Schools closed so that families could attend together. The spectacle had been part of the point. Punishment as public theater, the state demonstrating its authority in front of as many witnesses as possible. By the 1930s, the mood around public execution had shifted enough that Missouri's continued practice of it had become an embarrassment. It was the last state in the country still permitting public hangings when, in 1937, it finally brought the process indoors. The mechanism it chose was gas. The decision was not accidental. Other states had moved toward electrocution. The electric chair had been presented to the public since the 1890s as a clean, modern, technologically advanced method, the promise of science applied to the business of death. Missouri looked at the evidence of what electrocution actually produced and reached a different conclusion. Gas, its proponents argued, was more reliable, more controlled, and more humane than either the rope or the chair. It was the same argument that had been made for every new method of execution in American history, that whatever came next would be more civilized than what came before. The chamber was the latest iteration of that argument, built in stone and sealed with iron, installed inside the walls of a prison that had been making similar arguments about itself for over a century. A chamber was constructed that same year inside the Missouri State Penitentiary, built from stone quarried on the prison grounds. It was a small, sealed room. 2 metal chairs were bolted to the floor facing the witness window, a thick pane of glass behind which official observers would stand and watch. The condemned would be strapped into the chair, the door sealed behind them, and cyanide pellets dropped into a container of acid beneath the seat. Death, in theory, came quickly. Between 1938 and 1965, 39 people were executed by gas in that room. Then the chamber sat unused for more than 2 decades, not officially decommissioned, simply dormant, as legal challenges to capital punishment wound through the courts and Missouri's death penalty apparatus stalled. On January 6, 1989, the room was used one final time. George Mercer, known inside the prison as Tiny, became the 40th person to die in the Missouri State Penitentiary's execution chamber. His death was carried out not by gas, but by lethal injection. The chamber's sealed design, repurposed to accommodate the state's new method, the old machinery replaced, but the room itself unchanged. It was the last execution to take place at the penitentiary. 3 months later, in April of 1989, Missouri's death row was transferred entirely to the newly opened Potosi Correctional Center. On the wall of the gas chamber today hang 40 photographs, one for each execution. They are the only permanent memorial to the men and the one woman who died in that room, arranged in a grid that visitors stand before in silence on the tour. The faces are not dramatic. They are the faces of people photographed at intake, flat light, institutional backdrop, the look of someone who has just been processed by a system that has already decided what to do with them. The woman in those photographs is Bonnie Hetty. Her execution on December 18, 1953, was unlike any other the chamber ever witnessed. Hetty and her companion, Carl Austin Hall, had kidnapped 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease from a Kansas City school on September 28th of that year. She told the nuns at Notre Dame de Sion that she was the boy's aunt, that Bobby's mother had taken ill and was asking for her son. The child took the woman's hand and walked out with her. He was murdered shortly after. His body was buried in Hetty's flower garden in St. Joseph before the ransom was even paid. The family did not know he was already gone when they paid $600,000, the largest ransom demand in American history at that time. Hall and Hetty were arrested, tried, and sentenced within weeks. The judge called it the most cold-blooded, brutal murder he had ever tried. They were executed, side by side on December 18, 1953, the only double execution in the chamber's history. A second chair had been installed specifically for the occasion and remains bolted to the floor to this day. Hall was pronounced dead at 12 minutes past midnight. Hetty died 20 seconds later. Witnesses reported that the two whispered to each other in their final moments. Before the chamber was built, death row inmates had been held in a below-ground unit within the penitentiary, isolated from the general population, all services brought to them, permitted 1 hour of exercise per day in a small fenced yard adjacent to their block. When 70 death row inmates were transferred to Potosi in April of 1989, it marked the beginning of the end of the penitentiary's role as Missouri's instrument of final judgment. The room still smells, visitors say, of something chemical and old. The chairs, the photographs, and the window through which the witnesses watched is still there. 40 names, 40 photographs, one small limestone room. Chapter 6. The Night the Prison Went to War. The 1954 riot did not come from nowhere. It came from everywhere, all at once. After building for years in a place where pressure had no legitimate outlet and grievances had no formal channel, the factories that had once organized the inmates' days were gone. The population had not shrunk to match the emptied buildings. Men were crowded into cells designed for one, shared by 2 or 3, in a compound whose physical infrastructure was already decades old. The 1930 food strike had demonstrated clearly that the population was capable of coordinated action. The administration had noted it. The conditions that produced it had not changed. By the evening of September 22, 1954, the compound was a closed system under pressure it could no longer contain. It began, as so many things inside the walls began, with deception. 2 inmates in Housing Unit 3 faked illness severe enough to draw 2 guards into the block. When the guards arrived, the inmates overpowered them and took their keys. What followed in the next few minutes was a chain reaction that the prison's designers had never built a defense against. Cell doors opened, men poured into the corridors, and those men opened more doors, and those men opened more, until the cascade became impossible to stop. By midnight, approximately 2,500 inmates were loose inside the walls. The factory buildings became the first targets. Inmates tore through them, smashing what remained, setting fires. The sky above Jefferson City turned orange. Residents of the city could see the glow from their windows. The Missouri River reflected it. Inside the walls, the noise was described by those who heard it as continuous and total. Shouting, breaking glass, the deep percussion of steel doors being forced. The response was immediate and massive. The Missouri Highway Patrol was called. The Missouri National Guard mobilized. Police departments from St. Louis and Kansas City dispatched officers who drove through the night toward Jefferson City, some of them pushing their engines hard enough that the cars gave out within a block of the prison gates. Armed citizens took up positions on their porches with shotguns and waited. By the time the perimeter was established, more than 500 law enforcement officers surrounded the walls from the outside, while the inmates controlled everything within. The troopers on the roof made the first decisive move. As waves of rioters stormed toward the deputy warden's office, the officers positioned above the prison yard opened fire with Thompson submachine guns and riot guns. The gunfire drove the rioters back. The momentum of the surge broke, and most scattered to take cover wherever they could find it. But it did not end the riot. Approximately 300 men barricaded themselves inside B and C halls and refused to surrender through the night. In the early hours of September 23rd, a group of 18 troopers entered the building to take it back. Highway Patrolman Walter Wilson, one of those 18 men, later wrote an account of what he found inside. He described wading through 4 inches of water that covered the entire floor of the hallway. He described the inmates above him on the tiers, screaming and hurling anything they could lift: bedding, furniture, personal belongings, shards of the windows they had broken. He described a 50-pound block of ice pushed from a tier high above that missed his head by inches. And he described the water in front of one cell running red. An inmate had been stabbed earlier in the night. The last holdout refused to surrender when cornered and was shot. It was the act that finally broke the spirit of the remaining men. One by one, the barricades came down. When it was over, 4 inmates were dead. 29 had been injured. 4 guards had been seriously wounded. 1 inmate had turned the violence on himself. The damage to the compound was estimated at $5 million. Governor Phil Donnelly ordered an immediate and total shakedown of the entire facility. What the shakedown produced was a revelation about how thoroughly the institution had failed to see what was happening inside its own walls. Hidden in cells, concealed behind fixtures, buried under floorboards and tucked inside mattresses, officers found a private arsenal that had been assembled piece by piece over months and years without detection. Hundreds of homemade knives fashioned from scavenged metal, sharpened files, lengths of pipe, makeshift tools designed for purposes that had nothing to do with the workshops they had been stolen from. The weapons had not appeared overnight. They had been accumulating steadily, in plain sight of an administration that had not looked closely enough. The shakedown did not answer the question of how the arsenal had grown so large without anyone noticing. It only confirmed that it had. The ruins of the burned factory buildings remained visible for the next 10 years. There was no quick repair, no swift erasure of what had happened. The scorched ground simply stayed scorched, a reminder pressed into the physical fabric of the compound. It was this night, and everything it represented about the decades of pressure that had produced it, that would eventually find its way into a magazine article 13 years later. The label that article attached to the Missouri State Penitentiary did not describe only the riot, but the riot was the image behind it. The machine guns on the roof, the orange sky, the water running red under a cell door in B and C Hall. The hinge had turned. The prison that came out the other side of September 22nd, 1954, was not the same institution that had gone into it. Chapter 7. The End of 168 Years. The decades after the 1954 riot were quieter, but they were not peaceful. They were the quietness of a place running down, the noise of a machine whose parts are wearing out, whose original purpose has been revised so many times that the institution itself has become the purpose. The population that had peaked at roughly 5,300 in the early 1930s had declined from that extreme, but the compound was still full, still aging, still held together by maintenance that could never quite keep pace with the deterioration built into stone walls and iron bars and underground plumbing that predated living memory. Into this environment came Donald Wyrick. He was the youngest warden ever appointed to the Missouri State Penitentiary, and the only one in the institution's history to have risen through its ranks from the bottom, beginning as a guard, working his way through every layer of the institutional hierarchy until he stood at its head. His tenure covered what would prove to be the most turbulent years of the prison's final era. Where other administrators had managed the population through distance and force, Wyrick managed it through an unusual and specific skill. He could talk to the men inside. He knew their grievances because he had watched them accumulate from the ground level. He negotiated, communicated, and on multiple occasions diffused situations that had the potential to become a second 1954. No such riot came on his watch. 2 books were eventually written about him. The prison he ran was still brutal, still overcrowded, still fundamentally the same institution it had always been. But it did not burn again. In 1974, a change arrived that would have been unimaginable to the men who had designed the compound in 1833. Lillian Bonds became the first female correctional officer assigned to work inside a male correctional facility in Missouri. The same year, the official job classification for custody staff was formally changed from guard to correctional officer, a revision that signaled, however modestly, a shift in how the institution understood its own function. The tension that had defined the prison since the riot never fully dissipated. In the summer of 1996, rising hostility between officers and inmates pushed the administration to reinstate the search and response team, a specialized unit tasked with managing contraband and diffusing confrontations before they escalated. It worked well enough to prevent an explosion, but the fact that such a team needed reinstating 4 decades after the riot said something about the nature of a building that never fully resolved the conditions that had produced the riot in the first place. In 1991, the institution's name was officially changed to the Jefferson City Correctional Center. Then, in 2003, it was changed back to Missouri State Penitentiary, specifically to prevent confusion with the new facility being constructed nearby to replace it. The old name returned to the building like something that had never really left. On October 22, 2003, a murder occurred in the prison's ice plant. An inmate named Toby Viles was killed by 2 other inmates who worked alongside him. The 2 men, Shannon Phillips and Christopher Sims, did not attempt to escape immediately. Instead, they disappeared into a room they had been quietly preparing for an extended stay, a concealed space hidden behind a pegboard wall, where they planned to wait out the prison's final months and simply walk out when it closed. They were discovered 4 days later, not through surveillance or investigation, but because a staff member accidentally drove his hand through the pegboard wall and found the entrance on the other side. On October 14, 2004, the Missouri State Penitentiary closed. The new Jefferson City Correctional Center opened the same day. After 168 continuous years of operation, the oldest prison west of the Mississippi River processed its last transfer and went quiet. What was left behind was everything that could not be moved. The limestone perimeter walls, some sections dating to 1833, still standing along Capitol Avenue. A Hall, its dungeon cells intact in the basement. The 4-story cell blocks with their iron bar doors and layered paint. The gas chamber with its 2 chairs and its 40 photographs. 47 acres of accumulated history, locked and silent for the first time since the month the Alamo fell. Chapter 8. What Remains. The tours began not long after the gates closed for the last time. The Jefferson City Convention and Visitors Bureau took stewardship of the property, and what had been a maximum security penitentiary became something it is genuinely difficult to name cleanly. A historic site, a museum, a destination. Visitors walk the same corridors that inmates walked. They stand in the gas chamber, they look at the photographs. They descend into the dungeon cells beneath A Hall and stand in the dark for a moment before walking back out into the light. Some of the tour guides are former correctional officers, men who spent decades inside those walls enforcing the rules, counting heads, managing the daily calculus of a population that did not want to be there. Those same men now walk civilians through the compound and tell them what it was actually like. It is one of the stranger second acts in American institutional history. The authority that once kept people in is now the authority that explains the place to people who paid to enter. The knowledge is the same, the walls are the same, only the context has changed. What the Missouri State Penitentiary represents in the longer American story is something the building itself states more clearly than any summary can. It was constructed to serve a political purpose, to anchor a capital city. It was funded by an economic system that treated human labor as a commodity with no floor on its price. It was governed for most of its life by a philosophy of punishment that valued silence and productivity over anything resembling rehabilitation. And it ran, inside all of that, for 168 years, outlasting the era that built it, the philosophy that justified it, the industries that once filled its factories, outlasting Alcatraz, and outlasting every argument ever made about what it was supposed to be doing and why. It kept running because it was there, because the walls were thick enough, because the limestone held. Inside, the 40 photographs still hang on the gas chamber wall. The 2 chairs are still bolted to the floor. The witness window is still there. Nobody is watching through it now. That is what remains. Not a verdict, not a lesson, not a redemption. Just the walls and the rooms behind them, and the long silence where 168 years of American life used to be.